Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AIA Las Vegas June member meeting, Achieving Zero, with our special guest speaker, Vincent Martinez. I'm Randy Levine, Executive Director of AIA Las Vegas. We will begin our program in just a few minutes, but first, let us thank our sponsors for making our meetings possible. Oops, I'm sorry about that. Our special sponsors for this meeting are LGA Architecture, Carpenter Sellers Delgado Architects, and TSK, Tate Snyder Kimsey Architecture. Our visionary sponsors are John A. Martin and Associates, Clyde JUBA WALD, and KNIT. Platinum sponsors, that's our Nevada Sales Agency, TJK Consulting Engineers, Harris Consulting Engineers, Nevada Lighting, and 501 Studios. Our gold sponsors, American Insurance and Investment, Assurance Limited, AIA Landscape Architecture, Southwick Landscape Architecture, Loxa Engineering, and TERP Consulting. And of course, our silver sponsors, Bank of Nevada, Core Construction, Helix Electric, JLLP Inc., Nevada 5, Lage Design, Hogemeyer Design Group, SR Construction, EPG, and Silverlands Incorporated, and LGA Architecture. We will begin our program with the introduction of our President, Lance Kirk, AIA, President, AIA Las Vegas.
Thank you, Randy. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. As many of you know already, AIA Las Vegas's focus has been on climate change, taking action to transform the practice of architecture. Our objectives for 2020 have been built around, we're going to build a generation of architectural experts to be leaders on climate change. We're going to train design professionals on high-performance building skill sets and best practices that are going to be required in the next decade. We're going to demonstrate skills and abilities to act in the future. We will work with policymakers to set standards to reduce and eliminate carbon emissions. And we're going to lead and support the adoption of the Zero Code in Las Vegas and at the state level. And lastly, we're going to increase the number of firms who will support and participate in the AI 2030 commitment. So tonight, before we get started, let me take a few minutes to talk about the AI 2030 commitment. The mission of the 2030 commitment is to support the 2030 challenge and transform the practice of architecture in a way that is holistic, firm-wide, project-based, and data-driven. By prioritizing energy performance, participating firms can more easily work towards carbon-neutral buildings, developments, and major renovations by 2030. Joining the 2030 commitment gives you access to the Design Data Exchange, the DDX, a national framework created by AIA with simple metrics and standardized reporting format for measuring progress. The confidential
What happened?
The research tool allows you to compare projects of similar type, size, climate, and a host of other attributes across the 2030 portfolio. So through the 2030 commitment, you can elevate your practice, save your clients money, and combat the effects of global climate change. So I want to ask each of you tonight to join the 2030 commitment. Go to the AI 2030 commitment website and sign the commitment letter. What we need to do is get as many firms in Las Vegas to make the pledge and take us one step closer to the effects on climate change. So earlier in the year, we started with about, I think there was 4 firms in Nevada that had signed up for the to be a signatory. Right now we're at 8. So we've doubled our number of firms. So we're moving, we're making progress. But I had to go, I was really hoping by the end of this year we could have about 20. So I still think there's time, and I really encourage everybody to do your research, look into it, and commit to being a signatory. So before I introduce our featured speaker, I want to let you know we have set aside time at the end of the presentation to have a question and answer time frame. So please post your questions in the Q&A section on the panel. So some of you already know Vincent Martinez. He is the Chief Operating Officer for Architecture 2030 and has been working to solve the climate crisis by catalyzing global building decarbonization efforts throughout the development and activation of robust networks focused on private sector commitments, education, training, and public policies. Vincent also helped to set the organization's vision and currently leads Architecture 2030's work on urban zero net carbon buildings and public policy, including Achieving Zero, which we will hear more about tonight. So it is my pleasure to introduce Vincent Martinez. Vincent?
Thank you, Randy, and thank you, Lance, for having me. And it's wonderful to see the robust community there in Las Vegas so active. It's wonderful to see all your sponsors. So I want to thank your sponsors as well, and for inviting me as part of this series. Randy and I were speaking before the panel attendees came on, and I think the last time I was there to address you all was probably about 8 years ago, when AIA Las Vegas was one of the first components to launch the AIA Plus 2030 Professional Education Series that now has been offered in over 26 components across the US, including affiliation with the Ontario Association of Architects. So you were early leaders in the development of that series, and I know you're planning on hosting it again, I believe later this year. So it's really a great opportunity to learn more about some of those real-time strategies. So I want to thank you for hosting that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll get started. I've got quite a bit of material to share with you. All of it, I hope, will be relevant to your practice and your work and the impact that we all hope to make moving forward on these issues. Let me make sure, I think I can set up a spotlight video too, so that we can, you don't have to see the others. Lance, does that look like that's working?
Yeah, go ahead. I think that's working.
Okay, great. So I think that first and foremost, I want to make sure, it's been 8 years. I want to make sure everybody understands where we are right now. We've talked about climate change. We've talked about a climate crisis. We are a full-fledged climate emergency right now. And I know that there's quite a bit of other numbers of emergencies that are in our public discourse at the moment. But we're still very much at the start of this climate emergency. It's only intending to get worse the less and less we have impact and do something about it starting now. To put this in perspective, you've probably heard of a young woman from Sweden named Greta Thunberg, who has been really advocating on behalf of the youth generation to the UN and other advocating bodies around setting policies on climate change. And she's been talking about something called carbon budgets. And so we've certainly got the 2030 challenge, which I'll talk about, and we have our own reduction targets in the built environment. But what we really need to keep in mind is these carbon budgets. Carbon budgets are essentially the amount of emissions we have left that we can put into the atmosphere to not fuel dangerous, catastrophic, and pretty much irreversible climate change. So it really matters about how much we put up, and there's a time frame associated with our current patterns. So the climate budget is 340 gigatons of CO2 emissions that we can put up in the atmosphere. And that keeps us at a stabilized climate about 1.5 degrees Celsius of an increase from pre-industrial levels. We're about just over 1 right now. Once we get past the 1.5, we start approaching 2, which was one of the numbers in the Paris Agreement. Then we start to get really dodgy. The reason why it's 340 gigatons is that gives us a 67% chance, a 2/3 chance at staying at that budget. There's ranges on all of this. If you want a 50% chance, it's a 500 gigaton budget. And who wants 50-50 chance at the future for our generation and our children? So we want the highest probability we can, and that's what they're demanding is this 340 gigaton budget. So what does that mean for us? So we put out right now about 40 gigatons globally every year. And you can think of a lot of the commitments that you've heard of, either from professional practice, cities, states, governments, federal governments. They're all talking about 0 by 2050. Now, if we just take that carbon budget from 40 that we put out annually, and we phase out by 2050, we will actually put up about 600 gigatons of emissions. And that's almost double the carbon budget. So this 0 by 2050 stuff, that might have been able to fly 5 or 10 years ago when we first had the science was coming to full fruition. but it doesn't fly anymore. We've squandered that 5 years that we've had since the Paris Agreement. We really need to make aggressive reductions now. So in order to stay at that high probability at 1.5 degree temperature rise, we actually have to peak right now emissions, look for a 50 to 65% reduction by 2030, and a complete phase out of fossil fuel emissions by 2040. And this, I know this seems extremely dramatic, but I'm going to show you, I really feel like it's possible that we can get there, and the building sector can easily do its share at getting at this 65% reduction in the next decade. So when you hear all of the articles on climate change around the globe, and they're talking about the next 10 years are our most important years, this is the reason. If we miss this opportunity in the next 10 years, it gets harder and harder and harder to phase this out. So we really need to focus on these goals. Now, I want to take a little bit of a history lesson in the last 17 years or so. Many of you probably have heard of Architecture 2030 due to our founder and CEO, Edward Masria, and he really was looking at this connection between climate change and the built environment early on in the early 2000s. And he launched all of his initial research in a Metropolis magazine article called Architects Pollute, cover issue, very provocative in 2003. Prior to that year, this is the pie chart on the left is how we looked at the building sector. We were very small little slivers, residential and commercial construction. We consume 75% of electricity, but we were not attributed to it. We consume about 6 to 10% of all industry, but we were not contributed to it. So he reshaped the pie chart and called it architecture. And this is what the new pie chart that was launched at that time in 2003. And that really shook the industry to its core. Architects, of course, are meant to be making the world a better place for all of our projects and for our communities. And this was really a shock to the core of the industry. And it since galvanized then the 2030 commitment program with AIA, who has immediately adopted the challenge that we issued. But I want to show you the progress that we've made so far. So previous to 2005, so right after the Architects Pollute issue came out, from 1995 to 2005, this is where we were headed. This was the trend since the start of the Industrial Revolution. US GDP went up, and as US GDP went up, we started building more. Floor area would go up in the built environment in the US, and along with floor area would come energy consumption because we're building more and we're using more energy, and emissions would follow suit. We could take this back for energy, floor area, and GDP back to the start of the Industrial Revolution. CO2 emissions, we don't have that data that far back, so I'm starting in 1995. So this was the trend. What happened in 2005 was that we launched the 2030 Challenge, the AIA adopted it, and then slowly thereafter, of course, we had the recession, and things started to slow down for our sector. But what happened after the recession? We had a period of time, not unlike today, which we were stopping most of our practice. Our work was slowed down. We had a time to think about the issue. We were aware of the issue, and we came back and we did things differently. Take a look at what happened after 2005. We see GDP went down, and then it starts to go back up after the recession. Went up 26% since 2005 till 2019. Floor area took a dip. Then we start building like mad again, 18%. We built 47 billion square feet within that 14-year period. 47 billion square feet. And how about energy? Energy flatlined. And emissions actually dropped due to increases in fuel switching away from dirty fossil fuels. So this is historic. This is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. This is a decoupling of the economic growth of the built environment from energy consumption and emissions. Again, because we understood the issue, we had a moment to pause and do things differently. We have a very similar moment now moving forward as a globe, but also for other important issues beyond and operational emissions, which is what this chart is showing. Now, where did this come from? A large part of this came from demand reductions. This was where we're projected to have used, this red line. And instead, because of high energy efficiency in design, existing building energy efficiency programs, we were able to flatline energy consumption despite growing the building stock by 47 billion square feet. And then here's the on-site and off-site renewable energy has proliferated over the last decade. It's now much cheaper now, even in the utility scale, to build solar and wind than it is to build a dirty fossil fuel plant for new development. And then we're switching a lot of our old fossil fuels in over the last decade to gas, but now we're actually switching old retired coal plants into wind and solar because it's cheaper. So the economics have really changed quite a bit over the last decade. So that I hope will set us a precedent for how we're going to look at the future and how we're going to meet that 65% reduction by 2030. It tells us we're in a moment now where we can change if we get the understanding of the issue and how to really address it. So the way that Architecture 2030 looks at the built environment, we isolated into 3 separate camps. New construction, which has new building operations. And those are things that we've usually focused on in architecture, and the 2030 challenge and the commitment are all focused on. Those new buildings will also have all of the materials and infrastructure to support those buildings that will be built. Those are called embodied carbon issues. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then we have the entire existing building stock. There's a funny statistic that says 100% of our existing buildings are already here. We have an opportunity now to address existing buildings that need to get decarbonized as well, and will be here into our future. About 3/4 of our existing building stock will still be around with us. Actually, 2/3 will be around with us over the next 40 years. So we have an opportunity to renovate that, especially in North America, where we've built out so much already. So that's how I'm going to frame the presentation in these 3 areas. First, we're going to look at new building operation. Now, this is a frightening statistic, but also a great opportunity. Over the next 40 years, we expect to increase the global building stock by 2.4 trillion square feet. We about have 2.4 trillion square feet currently around the globe. So we're essentially doubling the global building stock. Everything we've ever built since the dawn of time, we're going to build again in the next 4 decades. It's the equivalent of about putting a New York City up on this globe every 34 days, a Paris a week, a Japan a month. So this is quite a bit of a building boom that we're going to experience to house a rapidly urbanizing population. So while we might be in a bit of a downturn now due to the pandemic, we're still expected to build a huge amount of this 2.4 trillion square feet over the next 40 years. And most of this construction is actually expected to take place in urban areas. And much of it early on is going to take place in the global north, where most of you do your work, North America and Europe and China, of course. Now, because we have to peak immediately, we have to make sure that all new construction comes in at 0 emissions. And what do I mean by that? That means that those buildings need to be energy efficient. We need to adopt the best model energy efficiency codes that are out there right now, like ASHRAE and IECC and Title 24. Some states are behind. Some states don't have codes at all. And we really need to up our game in terms of a policy mechanism to increase the efficiency of our standards of our new buildings. And then we as a practice need to increase our performance of our buildings beyond code. But energy efficiency will only get us part of the way there. By definition, we can't have 100% efficiency. Our buildings will always use energy. So we have to consider the source of that energy and make sure that that source is decarbonized. So we have to have carbon-free renewable energy. Mostly what that will mean is electricity. So Architecture 2030 embarked on an initiative called the Zero Code to augment and add additional renewable energy standards to new construction beyond the energy efficiency standards of the code. That's what Kirk was referencing, Lance was referencing earlier. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the Zero Code in a minute. But we have to make sure that all of our electricity is coming from renewable sources. I mentioned that we consume in the built environment about 3/4 of all the electricity produced in the United States. Yet we do very little with that demand. We basically take what the utilities are giving us. And we rely on our states and our energy commissions to set the requirements for renewable portfolio standards at the utility level. We have a huge opportunity in the design sector to change that paradigm, either by generating renewable energy on our buildings or by working with our clients to make sure that they're procuring renewable energy from the grid. And then finally, we need to make sure that our buildings stop being mini power plants. We install fossil fuel systems in our buildings every day, and that will continually become stranded assets. We'll essentially have to pull those out as we rapidly decarbonize the existing building stock. So we should be adding to the problem by putting fossil fuel systems in our buildings today. There's plenty of opportunity in every climate zone with new innovative technologies that have been around for a while in Japan and Europe for like heat pumps, for example, cold climate heat pumps and hot water heaters. We can remove these gas systems from our projects. So the rationale for the Zero Code, again, we have to peak today, and every new building will put additional load on the grid, and that load will mostly come in many places from fossil fuel electricity sources. So we need to bring our own renewables with us to not add to the And so what this also does is it creates a predictable market for additional renewable energy that goes above and beyond what the utilities are already providing or mandated to do. We can help accelerate the transition to a clean grid much faster than any state regulation. And renewables should apply for both a prescriptive and a performance approach. We should be able to predict how much our buildings should be consuming and then help work with our clients to generate that amount of energy or procure it from renewable sources. So it should have a prescriptive as well as a performance path. And we should be encouraging beyond code efficiency. Certainly we want to upgrade the codes from a policy standpoint and make sure that all of our projects are coming in with a base level of energy efficiency, but we can do more. And that would actually incentivize our buildings to have to use less renewables and keep those renewables to go towards a rapidly electrifying transportation system. So how does the zero code work? Well, you adopt the latest energy efficiency standard. In this case, it would be the latest one that passed from the IECC to the 2021. And as Lance mentioned, this is part of an initiative that's going on across the US right now in adopting the zero code. Adopt the best energy efficiency standard. And then if you follow the prescriptive path of the standard, you look at a table, it tells you how much renewable energy you need to add to your project. You add that to your project or you procure it. If you did the performance path, which I know many of you do, so you can have design innovation and flexibility, and you run energy models, the energy model will tell you how much energy your building is predicted to use, much like you would submit to the AIA 2030 commitment program, and that would determine the amount of renewables that your project would generate or procure. And that we want to incentivize those renewables to come on site on the building. It provides a whole host of benefits to the building owner for having that on site. And if they can't produce it on site due to high loads for like hospitals or laboratories, or due to shading constraints in dense urban environments, they should be able to buy that renewable energy from the utility or engage in a power purchase agreement with a developer. The zero code had a big win this last IECC code cycle that just closed early this year. It was adopted by the IECC, passed as written as a voluntary appendix. Now, what it means by voluntary appendix is that any jurisdiction across the country that has the ability to do so can adopt the appendix themselves, and then that would be the requirement for all buildings in that region. So if in this case, Nevada adopted the IECC, adopted the appendix, then the appendix would then say that all buildings within the state, new construction within the state of Nevada would have to bring their own renewables with them. And that applies only to the non-residential code. So it's multifamily and commercial, high-rise and mid-rise. So that's the path that's available. Even if the latest version of the energy efficiency standard, the 2021 of the IECC, is not adopted, you can still adopt the appendix to go with an older version of IECC. So that's a really positive framework in case there's opposition to increased energy efficiency. Obviously, we want to see that adopted as well. And AIA has been working with Architecture 2030, and we're working with local AIA components, advocacy organizations, large firms to push the zero code adoption locally. And so we're providing an entire work plan now for the next year to provide a network to share best practices on implementation and guidance, how to get those adopted and implemented. We're going to be hosting a workshop and train the trainers. We're going to work with code officials, and we're going to have a technical support team to answer all the questions about renewable energy procurement that's available in your area. So there will be support in any efforts that you or AIA Nevada or Las Vegas move forward with on this front. And I should also note that hot off the press, this isn't even published yet publicly. It's okay that I share it. I got approval. This comes from AIA. They just recently launched their climate action plan, which was vetted with all of the components at the CASE conference earlier this year in February. It is now for publication. We'll go out with the Blueprint for Better from AIA National here in a couple weeks. But you'll see that their top 20 priorities for 2020: architectural practice, knowledge sharing, and visibility and engagement. You see the last bullet point on the first and the last have to do with the zero code. AIA is 100% behind the zero code adoption. They champion it in the IECC process. They want to work with their local components to help get it adopted locally. I encourage you also to keep an eye out for that climate action plan. It's got a lot of really great strategies that AIA is going to be dedicating their resources to. As I mentioned earlier, my initial connection into AIA Las Vegas was to present during the first session of the AI Plus 2030 Professional Education Series. And that series is still available, and it sounds like it's going to be run again in AIA Las Vegas to help learn strategies so you can make your buildings more efficient. But there's also sections on renewable energy, both generation and procurement, within the series. We've made some additional modifications and updates since we last saw you 8 years ago. We partnered with AIA National to develop an online series, which I believe is the way that you'll be receiving the series this year, especially due to the pandemic. And so it's available on AIU, AIA's online learning platform, and there's discounts available for group viewings and for purchasing the entire series. There's also a certificate program for attending all of the 10 courses. So I'm really excited for you all running that again, and I think it's going to be a great reminder for those of you that have already been through it, but also really great new information for those of you just getting on board with the 2030 commitment and decarbonization in your work. Additionally, Architecture 2030 produced a tool called the Zero Tool to help you better understand how your buildings are performing compared to the baseline of traditional buildings around the turn of the millennium. It's able to track essentially your performance from energy efficiency standpoint, on-site renewable energy production, and renewable energy procurement in order to get to a zero net carbon building. Architecture 2030 does not create certifications or rating systems, but I'm happy to say that we partnered with the World Green Building Council on their Advancing Net Zero program, which works with all of their local green building councils that do have certifications for zero net carbon buildings. Both the International Living Future Institute has certifications that leverage tools like the Zero Tool. LEED now has a LEED Zero that has an energy pathway to zero net energy in this case, which also could be zero net carbon. And then many green building councils across the globe also have green building certification for zero net carbon buildings all across the globe. So if you want to be recognized for reaching these goals, there are availabilities for you and your clients that are third-party verified. I wanted to make sure that was also in the mix for your toolkit. And then finally, on new construction operations, I wanted to share with you, if you were not aware of it, Architecture 2030 has produced a global design language, form-giving design strategies called the 2030 Palette. It's 2030palette.org. It covers also planning and design strategies from the regional scale all the way down to city and town, district, site level, and building component. It's basically a visual encyclopedia of globally applicable design strategies. Many of your projects might even be featured in it. And if you're interested, we are always interested in new provocative images that demonstrate these principles. So please just reach out to us. We might want to feature one of your projects as one of these principles in the palette. So that's also available as a resource. I'm only showing a few of the Architecture 2030 resources, but there are, of course, dozens and dozens of resources, and AIA has a whole directory of how you can get up to speed on energy conservation and decarbonization renewable energy. I previously chaired the AIA Energy Leaders Group 2 years ago, and we've been working on a renewable energy brief that should be published, I hope soon, by AIA National that could also be very beneficial to you, because that is really an emerging area that designers need to get more in tune with, not only in generation, but also with procurement and working with your clients to secure long-term contracts. I'm going to move on to existing buildings. This has been a challenge. We know that architects work in existing buildings. Actually, the predominant number of architects work in existing buildings. We tend to focus on all the new construction projects, but we have a lot of work to do in renovating our existing building stock and adding on additional energy upgrades to millions of buildings across the US and the globe. We know that existing buildings in cities make up the majority of their emissions. In fact, we know that urban populations are the majority of their building stock is responsible for their emissions. You look at not just dense urban environments like New York City, but I would imagine this would hold true even to more sprawling metropolitan areas like Las Vegas, is that we typically see that the building stock, both large and small buildings together, represent at least half, if not 3/4 of the emissions at any city level. Obviously, you get into county and the full state, that looks a little different, but from a municipality, this is where the majority of their emissions are. It's in your sector, in the existing building stock. And so any climate action plan should focus on that. But now that we know that the majority of the emissions are in the building stock, we have to think about breaking the building stock up. This is some graphics that we produced as working on our Zero Cities project with 11 municipalities across the US that were focused on equitable decarbonization roadmaps. And what we can see from this is the top donut charts show that 1 to 2 to 4% of the total number of buildings in the city are the large buildings, in this case, above 20,000 square feet. So in terms of overall quantity, we have very few, again, 1 to 4% large buildings. But you can look below the corresponding green sections of their emissions is they can be, those large buildings, that 1 to 4% of the number of buildings can be responsible for 37 to 75% of the emissions in the building stock. So again, buildings are the major contributor to emissions in cities. Large buildings can be the major contributor to the entire building stock. So what this tells us is we're starting to see more and more policies being devoted to large commercial buildings. You've probably heard of energy disclosure and transparency ordinances that have popped up around the country, disclosing the large buildings required to talk about how much energy they consume. We're now starting to see regulation in this area, which I'll provide a few examples for. New York, San Francisco, Boston, DC, a city near you may consider these ordinances because they have large climate goals, and there's no way they're going to get at this if they don't start working on with their building owners to get at this issue. And we'll talk about interventions for how they do that. The other side of the coin are the thousands and thousands of small buildings. I know the numbers are a little small. I hope that you can see them on your screen. But take a city like Washington, D.C. Doesn't have a ton of high-rise buildings, really. It's relatively small scale in the Transact. They have 117,000 buildings that are below 20,000 square feet. I'm sure the numbers are even larger for a city like Las Vegas. And those are hundreds of thousands of buildings that will need to be decarbonized, either through energy efficiency and their fuel systems. So how do we get at all these buildings? So we can think about breaking them up into segments. Now, not all policies for existing buildings or practices for existing buildings is a one-size-fits-all approach. This is based on years worth of research that we've done with municipalities in investigating their building stock. First, we have to break up whether we're talking about large buildings or small buildings, but we also might be talking about owner-occupied buildings versus renter-occupied buildings. The people also matter about how we create policies and incentive programs in order to decarbonize the building stock. We need to think about what we're asking those buildings to do or what we're incentivizing those buildings to do. Will they be prescriptive requirements? Will they be performance-based? Will they require high levels or low levels of energy efficiency? Will they require electrification of fossil fuel heating systems? Will they require renewable energy generation or procurement? These are all the policies that are under development right now in cities across the country and really across the world. And then we have to think, most importantly, many people are talking about the first two pieces, but when will those buildings make their energy upgrades is the most critical factor. And you know that as a designer, timing is everything. As a new construction, you have so much freedom in the beginning of the design process in order to make big moves. The further you get along that design process, the more and more expensive that gets, the harder it is to overcome. It's the same thing with existing buildings. It's all about planning. If you have a large commercial building, you have something called a capital improvement cycle, and a time in which the building is already going through some sort of upgrades. Or you might have an intervention when you're getting ready to sell a building, or when a new tenant moves in and you're making tenant improvements. These are all great interventions for when you might create a policy or when you might want to intervene for lower cost and disruption. So we might consider policies, and there are already some available that I can talk about that are either date certain for those big buildings to give them time, or they're phased. They're tied to an intervention point when something's already going to happen. So we can consider, how do we segment these things? Again, we might consider when the what and the why, or the what and the when are different. The timing and what we're asking them to do might be different. And that can lead to policies, for example, that are performance-based. Large buildings, again, have more time and more decision-making process. You work with a lot of large commercial owners. You work with them to scope out a plan for when they make these upgrades. That's a great time to start planning for these decarbonization cycles and doing things in a particular loading order so that you can reduce the size of your equipment by working on your envelope first rather than the other way around, for example. And then there are prescriptive options. When we're talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of buildings that need to have energy upgrades and decarbonize over the next 40 years, we have to consider how do we get to that large number of buildings, and following intervention points that are also prescriptive by essentially saying we're not going to do an audit, we're not going to run through all the options, we're just going to help you make the systematic changes that you need by electrifying your heating system or for space heating or water heating. Those are great opportunities to make prescriptive policies to get to mass market at scale. If everybody is doing a relatively similar type of project, we can reduce the scale of or the costs of the workforce, and we can reduce the cost of the equipment by bringing in quantities of scale. And then again, we have to think about when these policies come in for different intervention points, especially those that affect frontline communities that are already disproportionately affected by the results of climate change and inequities in our system. So providing those incentive dollars first to those frontline communities or low-income communities can be a really advantageous way to build support for local policy. No, I talked a little bit about this, but I want to reiterate on why intervention points are so key. Very few organizations are working on getting at scale in existing buildings. And that's why we need the architecture profession to talk about their expertise, because they are the ones that help find out how to reduce upfront energy costs by aligning with these capital improvement cycles or these intervention points. You understand that we're talking about incremental costs when you're already having to replace a heating system, rather than upfront costs for the entire system if it's not at its end of life. How do we just stop disruptions to the occupants in a large commercial building retrofit? Lots of different tenants. We have to think about times like point of lease when tenants are out. We're doing tenant improvement cycles. The timing is really important to reduce costs and disruptions. And then also these intervention points are usually tied to financing. Think of a mortgage. When you're buying or selling a home, there's an low interest investment opportunity there where you can take the cost of decarbonizing and switching those systems over a 30-year period at a very low rate. These are the opportunities we have available if we time it correctly. If we don't time it correctly, the costs can be somewhere like 4 times higher. Rocky Mountain Institute has done some investigation on this. You can cut costs if you do them on cycle by 3/4. 3/4 seems to be the number of my presentation, it seems. I've used that number quite a bit, but it's always the same number, it seems. And again, some examples are capital improvement cycles, planned for large buildings, point of sale, point of lease, point of replacement, point of equipment replacement. This doesn't have to be a blunt instrument. This can be a scalpel. We can really do this right and not disrupt the economy. And we can also do this when we're doing a number of other life safety and resiliency upgrades that we're going to have to do to combat and adapt to climate change. So I know many of you are probably working on those types of projects there in the Southwest and Rocky Mountain region, but in other areas that might be more prone to other types of disasters. When we're upgrading for those, we should be upgrading for decarbonization. So I should note that all of this is available in our policy framework at achieving-0.org. I certainly encourage you to take a look at some of the policies, give us some feedback on what you think about them, and also to get involved in the policymaking process locally. Lance mentioned the Zero Code, which is a new construction. Certainly a big part of your business is new construction. Many of these existing policies are starting to emerge. Whether they happen in Las Vegas in the next year, next 5 years, they're happening all across in all the projects that you work on across the globe. So this is a time to get involved in the policymaking process and make sure these policies work and are effective and more easily implemented than if you were not at the table. We talk a lot in the design sector, especially around building code, that these are things done to us, rather than us joining that part of that process and making sure they work with us. So this is a great opportunity now that there's such a passion and movement around policymaking to get involved. I mentioned this before, but we need to provide incentives to frontline communities and early adopters. Obviously, we want to see you being early adopters, get incentives. There's a variety of different ways: low interest loans, grants, PACE financing opportunities, permitting, fast tracking, tax abatement. There's a variety of these. I'm not sure your local context, but I know that there's other non-financial incentives that cities are offering, like density bonuses for meeting some of these requirements in advance of a requirement. So being legislated. So there's a great opportunity here to take advantage of this, get ahead of the game before the hammer drops, and take advantage of many of these incentives that are starting to emerge around the country. Now, I mentioned the big buildings and the small buildings policy. This is the easy way to remember this. Big building policies need TLC. They need to be not tender, love, and care. That's great. It's a great acronym, but they need to have policies that are targeted, have longevity and consistency. Again, because the timing is everything. We need to know when the targets are coming, who they're oriented to, and then large building owners can work with their design teams to plan their upgrades accordingly so they're not held in penalty, but they're ahead of the game and get advantages of the incentives. An example of this policy is New York's Local Law 97. It's a greenhouse gas intensity cap, essentially, that will get ratcheted down over time. It says that existing large buildings in the city of New York cannot use more, produce more emissions from their fuels than a certain amount by building type. And then that ratchets down. There's other policies, like Boston has this as well. They also have an energy version. DC has an energy version. San Francisco has a version for renewable energy procurement. So we're starting to see more of these large, big building policies that, again, are targeted, have longevity and consistency. Small buildings, on the other hand, as I mentioned, there's hundreds of thousands of them. We need policies that have ESP, not extrasensory perception, although that would certainly help, but policies that are equitable, simple, and prescriptive. Again, hundreds of thousands to millions of buildings. We have to make sure that these don't disadvantage frontline communities and that they are simple and prescriptive to implement if we're going to build the market to get at all of these buildings over the next 4 decades. And there are examples of this. Actually, there's examples that go back 15 to 20 years. Burlington has a time of sale ordinance that requires prescriptive standards for energy efficiency. We used to have these, they were called RECOs and SECOs, residential energy conservation ordinances and commercial energy conservation ordinances. These were bipartisan approved legislation tied to intervention points because they were consumer protection. They didn't want consumers to be buying really leaky or inefficient buildings. And so this was an opportunity to make those upgrades at the sale. And that could be negotiated between the buyer and the seller. So this is not unheard of. This has been in practice for a long time. We just need to apply it to decarbonization. Again, I mentioned the Achieving Zero framework, and we have all of this information was provided working with 11 municipalities on our Zero Cities project with many other partners. I also want to mention the movement across the country from private sector leadership, not on policy development, again, but in coordination, setting private sector goals to work with the public sector. I happen to be involved in this movement and sit on its board of directors. The 2030 districts are private-public partnerships that are in now 22 different cities across North America. Perhaps Las Vegas might be interested in this type of partnership. I know you have similar kind of initiatives like green chips with some of your casinos, but this is essentially a private sector-led initiative to focus on energy efficiency and conservation, water conservation, transportation benefits in a downtown core, focusing on large building owners coming together, working together with the private sector partners on professionals like architects and engineers to come up with scalable solutions that overcome barriers in the market, and then working with their public policy makers to take down those barriers through public policy and provide incentives. I know that was probably a little bit different than you expected. I know we don't focus a lot on scaling existing buildings, but it really is a critical component to getting at achieving zero and decarbonizing our built environment. So I wanted to spend a good amount of time on it. The ending of my presentation is going to talk about embodied carbon issue. And there's been quite a bit of movement here, and there's a lot of complexity. I'm going to go relatively slow through it to bring you up to speed if you haven't already been aware of this emerging dialogue. Now, prior to 2018, nobody wanted to talk about this issue. Cities didn't want to talk about it. Industry didn't want to talk about it. Architects didn't want to talk about it. This was the big elephant in the room. Cities usually called this scope 3 emissions. This is outside of our scope. There's things we can touch, there's things we can influence. How do we get at the global supply chain of all of the heavy industry and materials? We can think of it in design professionals. Many of yours offices, which I'm sure you're itching to get back into, many of you, you know, how much of the office is dedicated to your material library? How many manufacturers come and knock on your doors every day to ask to do lunch and learn presentations to your staff to talk about materials? Materials is one of the biggest parts of what we do as designers. And when we think about the embodied carbon impacts, it starts to get overwhelming. We have millions of materials. We're talking about baseboard, flooring, paint, carpet, windows, vinyl, any number of things you can think of. How do we get our head around this embodied carbon issue? So this is where many folks were prior to 2018. What the heck do we do here? We were in the same boat. We got involved in this about 2010, did a whole lot of research, and came up with very few solution sets that really kind of made a large, meaningful impact. When we focused on prescriptive approaches, and more recently we pivoted to we focused on performance approaches, and more recently we moved to prescriptive approaches. You might have heard of some of this alphabet soup in the performance world of materials. Environmental product declarations, EPDs, life cycle assessments, LCAs, PCRs, product category rules, POs, program operators, not just CO2, but CO2 equivalent, global warming potential. There's this whole world out there around carbon and environmental impacts of building materials, not to mention all the great progress that we've made and continue to make on material health over the last decade. So where do we start? Well, first we have to change the conversation. We have to understand the issue. And so just like we did in 2003 with Ed and the Architects Pollute issue in Metropolis, we had the opportunity to curate the January issue of Architect Magazine to talk about the embodied carbon issue. It's called The Carbon Issue. It's Time to Quit. Another iconic image on the cover. There's 24 articles in here, all focused mostly on embodied carbon, some on operational carbon emissions. If you haven't gotten your copy, dust it off, get it out of your mailbox, pick it up, take a read. It's great information. It's also available online. It comes with your AIA membership. Architect is the official magazine of the AIA. So great opportunity, again, to change the conversation, to talk about the importance. And I'm going to go through what that importance is. Again, great sets of articles by my colleagues and other writers. So we start with a pie chart. The same way we did before. What was the issue? We were not represented in operational emissions in the US pie chart prior to 2003. That changed with Ed and the Architects Pollute. Same deal here. Building operations finally has a motivated group globally. These are global numbers now. 28% of the global carbon issue from a sector standpoint is building operations. That's all things we've been working on to date. Then there's this belly of the beast, industry, infrastructure, building materials, substructure, enclosure, finishes, equipment, systems. Where is the building sector in this? It's just called industry. There's a couple ways to slice and dice it. The Global Alliance for Building and Construction, which we're a part of and formed at the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, breaks out this way. Steel, cement, bricks, and glass, traditionally more of the structural enclosure systems, about 11% of global emissions every year that used to create all of those building materials. That's part of the picture, but we know that we're a part of the other side too with finishes and everything else that we have, insulation. So we think it's somewhere around here, but what's really interesting is about half of the industrial belly of the beast is concrete steel, and a very small sliver is aluminum at 1.5%, but about 10, 11% each for concrete and steel. These are our materials for structural new construction. Sure, we use wood for small residential. We're starting to use wood a little bit more for mid-rise. There's conversations about using wood for high-rise, and Master, we can talk about those too in the Q&A. But concrete and steel aren't going away. And we certainly use that for all of our infrastructure to support buildings. We're not building roads out of wood. So if half of the issue is concrete and steel, now we can start to get our hands on this thing. It's not a million products, it's 2. So what do we need to do about how do we use and how do we specify and procure concrete and steel as practitioners? That starts to get at this issue. But we also start to think about the time value of carbon. I mentioned the next 10 years are the most critical to make sure that we can meet the targets over the next 20 and 30 and 40 years. So the time value of carbon means 2 things. If we start to think about all the global new construction, I mentioned in New York City, put on this planet every 34 days. What does that do? Well, in year 1, this is the carbon emissions associated with building all those new buildings. It's all in the materials. We flip on the switch for 1 year, it's a little blip of those buildings. That is emissions that we will not get back. Once we do it, they're up in the atmosphere, we have to pull them out through sequestration. So every decision we make now on materials is that much more important. Yes, systems are important. Yes, operational emissions over the lifetime of that building are important, but we can change those systems. New buildings become existing buildings. They get subject to existing building policies and retrofits. We have a chance to change that little yellow piece. We lose that blue piece to the atmosphere on day one. And we follow this trend. Year 2, we build the same amount. Year 3, we build the same amount. We have the previous operational emissions and the new operational emissions, so forth, so on and so forth. We find even over the next 30 years, about half of the issue for our new buildings is operation and half is the embodied carbon. But we don't have 30 years. We have 10 years. I'm going to shrink this down. What happens in the next 10 years? We see that the embodied carbon is even that much more important from the overall quote unquote new life cycle, the next 10 years of that building. Let alone the fact that all of that is going up in the atmosphere again. We don't have the opportunity to change it. So this is really the big motivator about why we should care about this issue from a climate perspective. So how have people been focusing on this issue? So if we look at the past precedent in the 70s, when we really started looking at operational energy and carbon emission, how did we approach that issue? Well, we had one pathway at the time. We had a prescriptive path. We had rules of thumbs and attributes that defined a pathway for us as designers through the code. Check boxes, envelope efficiency, R value, U value, efficiency of the systems, lighting, watts per square foot, those kind of prescriptive attributes that you use every day in the code. It wasn't until the 90s that we actually had computer models that we could have a performance path. And what it did is it took all those attributes from prescriptive and it applied it in an energy model, and it said then you have the design freedom to go above and beyond and make trade-offs and decisions, and now you have a performance pathway. This is how we designed energy operations and now how we're approaching decarbonization through both pathways. Because prescriptive gets at scale, performance allows for innovation and design freedom. Now, embodied carbon really actually took the opposite pathway. It followed the performance pathway first. It said, let's look at life cycle assessments from cradle to gate, or cradle to grave, as they say, of the product, from when it was originally created to end of life, and let's add up all the energy consumption, let's add up all the emissions, and let's do a life cycle assessment. Let's get somebody to verify that, and let's create an environmental product declaration, which if you haven't heard of that, it's like a nutrition label for the product, but instead of counting calories, you're counting carbon. And that was an approach. The challenge with that, when we started on this path 10 years ago, is that it's extremely challenging to get that much data about a product, even for the manufacturers, because they're using components from a bunch of other different manufacturers. They have to collect all these small pieces to make sure that the vision of the full piece of the puzzle is visible. And then you also have proprietary data sets. You have different rules for the life cycle assessment, so you're not comparing apples to apples. It's very, very challenging. We made a lot of strides on this topic over the last 10 years. There's great tools, but it's not going to happen at scale. Certainly, we want to see all of your firms get up to speed on performance of embodied carbon in your projects. Running calculations, there's great software tools. But if we're talking about getting out every project in the world, and we're talking about building in New York City every 34 days, we need a scalable pathway that is prescriptive, that just tells people what to do, gets them in the ballpark. And so we engaged a few years ago and launched at the Global Climate Action Summit a prescriptive pathway. What have we learned from life cycle assessments, from product manufacturers, about what makes low carbon concrete, what makes low carbon steel, what makes low carbon insulation and drywall? And then we put all that together in a palette of its own sort. I just want to take one moment to say, if you're not familiar with these performance tools on embodied carbon, this is a growing field. I recommend that you take a look at a lot of these tools. The EC3 is the embodied carbon construction calculator, recently championed and launched by buildingtransparency.org and a number of industry partners, including Microsoft and Skanska. Athena has been out there for a while. Quartz, I think, was championed by Google. Tally was championed by an architecture firm in Philadelphia, Kieran Timberlake. One Click LCA comes out of Helsinki, Finland, has been used in Europe a lot. And then I actually don't know a whole lot about the last one, my colleagues do. But there's quite a bit of design tools available for you to get on the design side of things. There's essentially a couple of different areas that we'll go into of where you can really make a difference from design. But back to the prescriptive path. So we embarked on this carbon smart materials palette. take those prescriptive attributes of these products. And we focused on the high impact materials because we wanted to make an immediate impact. We couldn't wait for all the data, couldn't wait for it to be comparable, for it to be non-proprietary. We wanted to take action now. And so the the Carbon Smart Materials palette looks at attributes of these materials. So we will have steel, concrete, wood, insulation, carpet, and gypsum board available on the palette. We also talked about carbon smart materials, materials that are more bio-based, that could sequester carbon over their life. Things like bamboo, lots of really innovative things happening there. Hempcrete, you might have heard of that. Of course, wood, the rise of mass timber and sustainably harvested or climate responsibly harvested wood, it's all about where you get your wood from. Straw bale, even sheep's wool. And then we look at whole building approaches. This is more of the design practice standpoint. How do you use these materials more effectively? This really falls into your structural engineers camp, but certainly architects should be aware of that. There's really simple things to do for how you use drywall and design for drywall. There's really interesting things you can do with how you create your spans. So it's really great information to take a look at, curated and developed not by Architects 2030, but by practitioners. So your peers in the industry. So I'll give you some example. We have a swatch on insulation. Talks about where the high impacts are on insulation. Insulation particularly is about what is used to make that insulation. We find that more chemical-based foam materials have much, much higher, orders of magnitude higher carbon outputs than we would from other types of systems. So in this case, the recommendations would be not using things like XPS unless absolutely critical, like under a slab or something. So you'll see some of those recommendations that are below. There's also design guidance for how you use and specify these materials. This is just one example. We also acknowledge that we don't know everything. There's unknowns and questions and areas that the industry really needs to focus on and push on our manufacturers to be more transparent about those and make innovations on their own. There's a little bit of a push-pull with the prescriptive approach. They feel just as hamstrung in a manufacturer by a prescriptive approach as you do in design. They say, give me a performance target, let me meet it. But sometimes we need to be pushing them in multiple directions for them to start innovating on their products. So the interesting thing, I'll back up one second, about embodied carbon is we were really in this world about products, right? Concrete and steel, certainly highest impact. I mentioned the other high impact materials. It's about what art designers, what they used and how they used it and what they procured and what they did with their specifications. We've since recognized that embodied carbon is part of a larger universe about whether we build at all, about how we use the existing carbon we've already used to create materials in both infrastructure and existing materials in buildings, and how we better use those. More of a circular economy principle, if you've heard of that concept, mostly emanating out of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in Europe. Arup did a big report with them on how the circular economy principles could be adapted to the built environment. Great read. There's a couple documents. I'm happy to share them afterwards. But we have to start to think, do we really need 2.4 trillion square feet of new construction over the next 40 years? Certainly, I know you'd love to design it. But do we need it to house a growing urban population? Can we renovate a lot of our derelict infrastructure so that we can better use it and better serve our communities? Can we densify? Can we infill? So we have to think about these as part of a larger embodied carbon conversation, because now we don't need new materials. Yes, if we do need them, we should make sure that they come in at low carbon or carbon sequestering, but what do we really need in the built environment? Can we think differently about what we do when we have, again, this moment of pause due to the pandemic? We can think about what we're going to do differently when we come back. And certainly developers are thinking differently because they can't even use the assets they've created right now. And it's going to be a while before they're at full capacity. So how do we reuse existing infrastructure is a big part of the embodied carbon conversation, both, again, from a building perspective, an infrastructure perspective, and a material perspective. How can we reduce the need for new infrastructure and new materials by densifying our urban environments and creating walkable, livable communities attached to transit-oriented developments and avoid sprawl of new infrastructure? And then how can we use our landscapes and our materials to sequester carbon? Well, you probably heard of Paul Hawkins' book and research on drawdown. It's not enough just to stop emitting. We actually need to start sucking carbon out of the atmosphere through these natural sources. And our designs and our sites and the plants that we put into our sites, and even the materials like concrete can sequester some of that carbon over its lifetime. We can talk about those details. And then when we start as a rapidly forming policy landscape around embodied carbon, as much as you may not even be up to speed on it from a practice perspective, it will soon be regulated. We already regulate, of course, energy conservation. We're focusing on regulating emissions. Now emissions will be focused on embodied carbon issues. We have the privilege to work with a firm called BioNova that runs One Click LCA out of Finland and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance to work on an embodied carbon policy framework for municipalities. It looks at a variety of options. We identified 50 potential policies for municipalities, all the way from planning and land use issues down to procurement issues at the city level, and incentives and awareness and education programs in the mix. So a whole lot there in this report. It just got launched last week, actually, and there's a website for it, embodiedcarbonpolicies.com, to download the report. Quite a bit of wealth of information in there. These policies are already starting to form and are being advocated for locally by many jurisdictions across the globe. So be aware that this is coming as well. And again, this is in the form of regulations, codes, incentives, and programs. It's not all blunt instrument either. Some examples of that, we created these policy cards to give some examples of what is precedented already across the country and then what could be precedented. This is an example that comes out of Marin County on a low carbon concrete code that they just passed last year, I believe. Any concrete poured in Marin County has to meet these requirements. There are both prescriptive and performance pathways. The prescriptive pathway, right now, most codes say there is a minimum amount of cement that you need to put into your concrete mix to maintain its structural capabilities, of course, with factors of safety. But cement is where the carbon is. Cement equals carbon in concrete. That's where most of the emissions come from over the chemical processes. What they're saying now in the prescriptive approach is there is a maximum amount of cement you can put in, so that you don't overdo the cement content and add to more emissions more than you need to. Obviously, it's still structurally safe, et cetera, but that's one pathway that they're taking. The other is performance-based. It says through an environmental product declaration from your concrete supplier, which now National Ready Mix has thousands and thousands of environmental product declarations, for example, that then you specify the global warming potential of that concrete. It's a certain threshold, make sure that you're below that mark, and then you're okay to use it. So both prescriptive and performance approaches, not unlike how you would have a performance approach for a building. You can either do these things and check off the list, or you can design a performance pathway. So we're starting to see these policies emerge. I imagine I'm actually probably right on time, but I wanted to pause there and give enough time for a robust discussion. I know it's a little challenging using an online format to do that. I'm sure Lance and Randy will do a tremendous job navigating all the Q&As. I can also follow up later. I could talk about any number of these topic areas, anything that seems like it's useful, or even other things that I didn't bring up. Feel free to ask me. And I'll probably stop the deck right now for this purpose.
Thank you, Vincent. That was a very informative presentation. A lot to take in. You guys have been doing a tremendous amount of research and coordination with other markets and entities. So this is great. We do actually have a couple questions here, and I'll remind everybody to go into the Q&A section and please ask your questions there. We've got a couple minutes here. Joe is actually asking, what new technology or building material that are you excited to start seeing implemented in architecture?
I'll tell you the one Ed, our founder, is most excited about. He won't stop talking about it, which is bamboo. Now, we traditionally think of bamboo being in certain only regions of the world. It's got tremendous tensile properties. Sometimes they use it instead of rebar in concrete mixes as a tensile material there. There's been a lot of new design, interesting design, mostly in tropical regions, albeit in pole architecture with bamboo. But more recently, there's been innovations in creating, just like we would with this new movement with mass timber, cross-laminated beams and glue lams. They're making bamboo lams and bamboo strand OSB kind of things out of bamboo, plywood out of bamboo. It's a company called Bamcor, for example. You could take a look at some of those attributes on the Carbon Smart Materials palette. But what's really exciting about bamboo, it's extremely strong in a number of factors. It grows extremely fast compared to traditional timber. The other benefit is that it's technically a woody grass. It's not a tree. And so most of the plant's infrastructure is underground in its roots. And as you cut it, its roots grow deeper. Why it's so hard to get rid of the grass in your lawn, in your sod, right? Every time you cut it, it gets stronger and stronger. You have to really dig it out. Same thing with bamboo is you're actually making it stronger every time you harvest. It sends all of its power back into its root system, and then it grows another shoot. So it can be harvested regularly, and typically you don't run into deforestation kind of approaches because you're not clearing the full site all at once. Most of the the bamboo harvesting is about a third of the forest at that time. So great potential impact from strength, from a climate perspective and sequestration, a growth and forestry perspective, but also a tremendously durable material under the right circumstances. And there are a lot of innovation being focused on that front, just like there is on the mass timber design movement. The other thing I'm super excited about on the materials front, it's not quite ready for prime time yet, but some of the material research labs in the university, for example, Cornell has done this, is something called a biocomposite. It's essentially taking biomaterials like waste agricultural products or soybeans, separating and creating a resin and a fiber, putting those together just like you would make carbon fiber for the front fork of your mountain bike or for the airplane hull. And you're using that to create a biocomposite that can essentially make a biocomposites rebar out of soybeans. I've seen it, I've held it in my hand. It's extremely powerful for tensile strength. They've made a footbridge out of it in the Netherlands. There's Arup invested with a facade company. They did a prototype building called BioBuild, which is a facade essentially around a window. Of course, the window is not biomaterial, but the whole entire framing and cladding system is all bio-based. The also really cool thing about that, better than carbon fiber, is we're going to have, carbon fiber doesn't decompose very well, even under any circumstances, really. We're going to have airplane graveyards. But what biocomposites under the right pressures and additives will decompose. So you have the added benefit there. There's also really crazy stuff about growing bricks out of bacteria out of the University of Colorado Boulder. You can essentially have just like your little yeast packet, go in your backyard and put things together and grow your own bricks. They're thinking about using it on other planets because you're not going to take a bunch of materials. You're going to use what's there, and you're going to add this bio binder of bacteria that will be self-grown. Really cool stuff. It's called the Modern Prometheus Project. Anyway, I could talk for days, but those are like the three really cool highlights. Probably the most applicable is the bamboo at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And so we have a question from Mark. How receptive is the construction industry with these alternative material options? You know, of course, it's sometimes hard to get change old habits with construction and general contractors.
I'd say there's probably a handful of approaches. Certainly, we're not going to stop using concrete and steel, and those industries, specifically the concrete industry, have really stepped up to the plate to find low carbon alternatives, to really get out in front. Sometimes those are more traditional and they're just lower options, and sometimes they really reinvent the wheel in terms of how they do their products. There's a group now still in incubation and in startup mode called Boston Metal that's making a zero carbon steel. It's still, it's still from a traditional steel standpoint, they use a completely different processing, but you can get really far there. You can get really far by buying recycled steel from electric arc furnaces, which is mostly the US steel. We have a ton of scrap steel. It's very recyclable. We could use recycled steel rather than raw resource steel from China. You reduce your footprint considerably. It's not zero, but it's a significant improvement. And if those facilities are powered by renewable energy, you knock it down even further. So that's another great option. Not one pretty close to you all in Southern Colorado is a renewably energy powered electric arc furnace steel plant. So you want to ask, it's hard to get those things. You have to ask a lot of questions to get them in your supply, but that's also possible. So then you're not really doing anything new. So in that case, from a contractor perspective, it meets all the performance specs. They're using the same material they've always used. I think the real piece of new innovative materials has been mostly on mass timber. And there's new building codes now that allow you to build to 18 stories as mass timber. We'll see how many of those we get, but you can design and now build legally to those standards, and contractors are getting on board. Actually, many of the contractors like Skanska and Turner really like, and Lend-Lease particularly has been championing mass timber design because they can build faster. It's modular, gets shipped to the site, it goes up super fast, and it's all about timeline, right? So if you can design it well in these systems, they're building these mass timber buildings way faster than they would take to cure all the concrete and put all the formwork up. I think in Singapore, there was an airport that went up as mass timber, not from a carbon perspective, but because they didn't want to deal with all the monsoons and hurricane winds coming through there while they were waiting for the concrete to dry. So they did it out of mass timber and it was much faster. So I think there's a big movement there. And if we adapt some of those, like bamboo it's almost exactly the same. It's kind of similar approach. You're switching out a more of a traditional system with a different innovative material.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of those, they're tied to our Las Vegas, right? We're in the middle, we're kind of an island here in the desert. So how do we get certain materials here? Or do we use what's native, more what's native? Because even wood, it comes from so far away, right? And steel for that matter too. So you're right. We've got to look more internal in our local market to find the right building materials.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about bamboo is you can pretty much grow it anywhere. There's like 125 species, and they grow in all sorts of climates. I know it seems weird to think that you might grow bamboo in your climate, but many of you might even have it as in your backyards as cover from your neighbors.
Right.
Certain varieties. Obviously, they're not all structurally capable, but take a look at our swatch, and you might learn a little bit more.
Yeah, good. That's a good point. So there's another question actually that's kind of ties to what you were talking about with the existing buildings and the doubling our square footage in the next 40 years. And so with what's the new normal, right? And you're hearing about Twitter and Facebook, and they're talking about not going back to their offices. Do you think this what we're going through with this pandemic change that footprint, that maybe it won't be in 40 years doubling our square footage?
There's still debate out about it. I actually think it depends on the region, because all of this new construction, this new planet we're going to build in the next 40 years happens. I didn't show the slide. It's in the Architect Magazine article, but you can see where it's going to be built. Everybody says, oh yeah, it's China. Yes, a lot of it is China, but China's kind of stops building in 10 years. They're going to be built out. We continue to build on a little bit of time in North America. Europe doesn't build that much at all, considerably. All of the building boom will move in the next 10 years to the global south. It's all going to be India, which has the same population roughly as China, but about a third of their infrastructure. It's going to be building like mad. You've got all of Africa, again, about the same population of India, also going to be building like mad. And you've got Latin America. There's something in China called the Belt and Road Initiative. You've heard of that initiative. They're basically buying up ports in all of these growing regions and creating infrastructure for supply chain so that they can ship off their materials when they stop building to these other regions. That I don't think is going to change. That they have a growing population, they're rapidly urbanizing, they're growing in their economies. Despite the pandemic, they will continue to do so. They'll rebound. They will still build. I think it's America and Europe that will slow down and start using our existing infrastructure. So I don't think we'll build 2.4 trillion, but we might build something like 1.8 or something like that. Yeah. So we're still plenty of work for y'all. Don't worry. But it will look a little bit different. And I think we have to start thinking differently as architects about when we're talking to the developer for a double win on both operational emission reductions by retrofitting existing buildings and decarbonizing them, but also an embodied carbon win because we don't need new infrastructure and new materials. And that's a great design challenge. There's a lot of really great buildings out there that can be revitalized by architects. And think about the alternative. We don't want all the ESCOs to take that market and just swap out the systems. We want to do facade renovations and interesting things with the architecture. This is our opportunity to change the game, even coming back and make these spaces more livable and hospitable.
Yeah, that's great. So we have one last question, and Keith is asking, what about reducing plastic waste generation, recycling, so we don't have all this trash, right? This in the ocean in particular, but how that may be weighing in on some of this conversation.
That's interesting. We don't get as involved, but there have been a few design guides about designing out waste. And those are usually having to do with the waste systems in the building themselves. So you bet your tenants can better, or the tenants of the building, can better handle all of their material supplies, centralized chutes, and then, easements and things out in the property line. So you can have the recycling materials, but those don't get you very far. That's a building approach, certainly, and it's helpful and it's important, but, those issues are so large and systemic to how we manufacture products in this world, really. But there's been a lot of innovation, same thing with building materials, with building products. I live in an area where we pass laws that say no more plastic straws, no more plastic cups, no more plastic cutlery. And guess what? Well, you still have those things, but they're just not made out of plastic. They're bio-based. They can be composted at our industrial compost facility. We need to start seeing more of that, and I think designers can get more involved in the choices of the materials, maybe not in all the commodities and the disposable things that your clients will work with, but certainly in a lot of the systems that we work with. The other opportunity is around enterprise systems. So I don't know if any of you have heard that Philips lighting, for example, lighting is not the type of plastic that we're really talking about here, but I'm sure there are elements in it that have an enterprise model that says we will rent you lighting services. So rather than you buying for your client a bunch of LEDs, you get in a long-term contract. It's no longer an upfront cost. It's an ongoing operational cost. And what happens is when a new technology comes online, Philips takes their old technology and they give you a new one. And guess what they do with that old technology? They put it back into their supply chain. Dell Computing is doing this because they recognize there's not enough raw metals to handle all the computing power for all the microchips and everything that they want to serve for a growing world. And so they can't find nickel and all these other things in the global marketplace anymore. So they're having their own enterprise model. They've designed their computers for disassembly, like we should be designing our buildings for disassembly, to reuse those materials and take them back. Same kind of model as Philips. You rent their computer. When a new model comes on, they take the old one, they take it apart, they take out the raw materials, they give you a new computer, and you're good to go. Pretty innovative. Yeah. It's kind of like the buy or buyback thing. We're starting to see that circular economy principle taking off in the built environment a little bit. You've got things on the residential scale, mostly with, I don't know if you have reuse stores or Habitat for Humanity. You know, people can drop off their old light fixtures and somebody might want to use them for a sub-project, or they'll make art out of it or something like that. We have almost unlimited supply in the commercial sector, but there's this stigma around using existing building materials. Everybody wants something new and shiny, new doors. It's a great company in Pittsburgh called Unhinged, I believe, Design Unhinged. That's their whole business model is to take old commercial doors, refurbish them, hold them in a warehouse, and then sell them. And you get them for cheaper, and they're just pretty much just as good as you. You know how often you do a tenant improvement, people want new stuff, and you throw it out, rather than that going in a landfill. It's not the plastic piece always to the question at hand, but it's a big part of our disposal issue.
That's a good point. We do have active reuse stores here, a number of them, and they're a lot of the contractors use them and be able to put their existing materials through there. So it's a great system there.
There's one more thing on that point, and I know I just keep going on and on because there's so many exciting things happening around the world. The other one that might be of interest for plastic in particular is that people have been putting in voids in their concrete slabs in order to have, you have to design it right as a structural engineer. But you could essentially take a recycled material, create like a vacuum ball and put it into your concrete mix so you don't have to use as much cement. And then you're sequestering that plastic in the design. And then you have issues though with taking apart, which is always an issue, and we should think about that. But there are other options available for using. We see that actually happen with glass. Glass posylons can be used as a cement replacement. I know Durst's organization did it for a couple of towers in New York recently. So for a couple of podiums, something to look into. And I think it's also listed in our concrete sponge.
Okay, great. Yeah, great information. So there was actually one last question. It really is more based on the client, right? And sometimes it can be a little bit challenging to have the resources, educate them, and right, because they're sort of the leaders of our design. They're the ones funding our project and often come with their own vision. So any advice or thoughts on that of how to engage the clients and bring them on board?
Sure. Ed has this, has his own argument. I have mine. So I'll tell you mine first. One is that you'd be surprised at how many clients have environmental portfolios and ESG requirements, and their investors have those requirements of them. Sometimes they are waiting for us to step up and talk, and they're disappointed when we don't. So don't be quiet because you think that the client doesn't want this. Many cases they do, or they don't know that it's an add-on, and it's not, they think it's an add-on service. It's not part of your practice. This should be part of your practice, and we should be moving on there despite all of those other pieces. But many of the clients really want it. We work with a lot of developers and portfolio owners, and they are saying, we're waiting for the architects to say that they're signed up to the 23rd commitment, they want to work for it. I have to bring it up in the meeting. That's what my colleague has said. He doesn't want to be the one to bring it up. He wants you to bring it up. So I think we should think about that a little bit. But certainly there are clients who may see it as an add-on service or may not be motivated on it. Ed's argument is that's a red herring. You have to come in on budget and you have to come in on time, and you have a lot of design freedom. Certainly your client might be more vocal about one thing or another, but for the most part, a client isn't saying, I want you to build this building out of steel, or I want you to build this building out of concrete, or, I want 3 coats of paint sanded in between each coat of paint on the walls. You make those types of decisions. I want this kind of floorboard or that kind of floorboard. A lot of the times you have so many decisions that you can make to balance for high performance design and for decarbonization. It should just be standard practice. We shouldn't be treating these as value engineered out at the end of the project. This is just good design.
Yeah.
And it's being rated as such. If you look at the last number of AIA design awards, more and more of them, the large majority, are coming from sustainable practice. All the COTE Top 10 design awards, more and more of those are winning the major design awards. The firm Payette was Firm of the Year last year, I think. All of their projects are high performance. They're leading the pack. If you want to be a market differentiator, you have to be doing this. Otherwise, your clients, especially institutional clients, universities, hospitals, laboratories, they're just not going to pay attention to you if this is not part of your design suite.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Great. And a great way to end it, because that's a good point that you mentioned Payette, and I think it's the last 7 or 8 firms who have won the Architecture Firm Award. They have all been signatories of the 2030 commitment.
Right.
So there's something telling of that as well, that this is where the industry's going, and we need to pay attention to that. And so thank you, Vincent, for wonderful presentation. It was very enlightening and informative. So thank you for joining us. And so I want to let everybody know this meeting is recorded. So it will be available on the AIA Las Vegas website in the next few days. You can also watch for the weekly meeting or weekly emails that go out from AIA Las Vegas to talk about all our programs and events. So please follow that and be able to see all of our events coming up. And we'd like to thank our sponsors again for our annual sponsors and our June membership meeting sponsors. Thank you. And again, thank you, Vincent, and thank everybody for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to follow up on any future questions that anybody might have.
Great, thank you. We will watch for that. Thanks, Vincent. Good night, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Good night.